You know that feeling when the person you'd take a bullet for is the one pulling the trigger? Have you ever realized in a single heartbeat that your entire life was a lie? I was sitting in my car, my chest aching as I fought for every breath. My hands trembled against the steering wheel as I stared at the warm glow of those penthouse windows. Inside, my husband was laughing, the same rich, confident sound I'd spent 15 years falling in love with. The man I helped build while my own dreams gathered dust. But then the glass shattered. I heard Rian's voice through the cracked door, casual and cruel. "Julie, she's not family. She's the ladder I used to get here, and she's too invested to ever walk away." A sob broke from my throat, and I pressed my hand to my mouth so they wouldn't hear me fall apart. The 15 years of us vanished in that one sentence. I looked at my wedding ring through my teary eyes, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't see a promise. I saw a cage. And in that moment, I realized the greatest betrayal wasn't what he did to me. It was how long I let him. The silence in the car was suffocating, thick with the scent of the expensive leather upholstery that I had picked out for him 3 years ago. A small reward for a promotion I had practically scripted. Every inch of this vehicle, every stone in that driveway, and every light flickering in that penthouse was a monument to my sacrifice. I looked at the dark silhouette of the house, my chest heaving as another sob racked my body, threatening to crack my ribs. 15 years of loving him. And somehow it had led to this. My mind betrayed me, dragging me back to a rainy Tuesday 10 years ago when we shared a single bowl of ramen in a studio apartment that smelled like damp paint. Rian had tucked a stray hair behind my ear, his eyes shining with a devotion so fierce it felt like a vow. "One day, Julie," he had whispered against my forehead, "I'll give you the world because you are mine." I believed him. I fed that ambition with my own career, my own identity, until there was nothing left of me but his support system. But tonight, that memory felt like a poison. The man inside wasn't the boy from the studio apartment. He was a stranger wearing my husband's face, counting me among his assets like a piece of depreciating office furniture. I wiped the dampness from my cheeks, my breath hitching as a cold, sharp clarity began to replace the grief. He didn't just take my time. He took my love and mistook it for weakness. I loved him until I broke, and somehow he thought that meant I'd never leave. The ring felt heavy, a leaden weight dragging my hand down. I realized then that the foundation hadn't just cracked, it had turned to dust. And as I put the car into gear, the ghost of the woman I used to be finally began to scream. I closed my eyes for a moment, and suddenly I was back 15 years ago in a crowded library, smelling old paper and cheap coffee, where none of this pain had yet touched me. The shift in the air was instantaneous, the bitter chill of the October night dissolving into the sweltering, crowded heat of a university library. Rian wasn't a titan of industry then. He was just a boy with a sharp jawline and eyes that burned with a hunger for a world he hadn't yet conquered. He was buried under a mountain of textbooks, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms coated with the tension of a man who refused to sleep until he won. I had tripped over his bag, a clumsy, fated moment that brought his world crashing into mine. When he looked up, the irritation in his gaze vanished, replaced by a sudden, predatory focus that made the air in my lungs vanish. He didn't just look at me. He mapped me. His eyes lingered on the way I tucked my hair back, tracing the curve of my neck with a heavy, unhurried intensity, that felt like a physical touch. "You're always in such a hurry, Julie," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and strike straight at my heart. He leaned back, a defiant, arrogant smirk playing on his lips as he watched me struggle to regain my composure. "Careful. If you keep looking at me like that, I might think you're impressed." I felt the heat climb my throat, my pride sparking against the sheer magnetic pull of him. I straightened my shoulders, meeting his gaze with a defiance that I would eventually lose over the next decade. "I'm impressed you're still talking," I shot back, my voice steadier than I felt. The arrogance in his expression softened into something far more dangerous. He didn't laugh. He just let out a slow, rhythmic breath, his eyes darkening until they were the color of a midnight sea. "That sounded like flirting," he whispered, the words hanging between us like a confession. In that moment, the rest of the world blurred into a gray haze. There were no billions, no betrayals, and no lonely cars. There was only the electric, a terrifying realization that this man was going to change the trajectory of my entire life, and I was going to let him. The transition from that library floor to the high-stakes boardroom was a blur of caffeine and shared ambition. We weren't just a couple. We were a storm. I remember the late nights in our cramped office, the only light coming from the blue glow of laptop screens and the street lamps bleeding through the blinds. Rian would lean over my shoulder to review the presentations I'd spent 18 hours perfecting, his breath warm against my ear, his scent, sandalwood and pure, driven adrenaline, enveloping me until I couldn't tell where my ideas ended and his began. Every time his hand brushed my waist or rested briefly on the small of my back, a jolt of electricity would override my exhaustion, pinning me to the moment. He was my shadow and my shield. I remember a networking gala early on when a senior partner from a rival firm tried to corner me. His smile a little too wide, his hand lingering a second too long on my arm. Before I could even draw a breath to deflect him, the air in the room shifted. Rian was there, a silent, predatory force. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply stepped into my space, his chest nearly brushing my shoulder, his gaze turning to ice as he looked the man down. "She's with me," he said, the words vibrating with a possessive authority that made my heart hammer against my ribs. I laughed it off later, calling him overprotective, but deep down, that raw alpha claim made me feel invincible. I thought it meant he valued me. I didn't realize then that he was just guarding an asset. The peak of it all, the moment that sealed my fate, happened on the balcony of our first real apartment. The city lights were reflected in his eyes as he took my hands in his grip firm yet strangely trembling. There was no diamond then, just a promise that felt heavier than any stone. "Julie, when I build my empire, you'll be standing beside me. Not behind me, beside me." He looked at me like I was the sun and the stars, the very gravity that kept his world from spinning into chaos. I believed him with every fiber of my being. I poured my soul into his foundation, never imagining that the empire he promised me would eventually become the very thing he used to crush me. The success didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a cold, sharpening silence that began to fill the hallways of our new, hollow mansion. The empire was built, but the man who promised I'd stand beside him was retreating into a fortress of glass and steel. Our conversations, once marathons of shared dreams that lasted until dawn, had withered into clipped functional exchanges about schedules and board meetings. The electric tension that used to pull us together had shifted into a static hum of distance. I found myself haunting the rooms of our life, searching for the boy from the library in the eyes of the tycoon who now shared my bed, but not my soul. There was one evening, just before the gala that would cement his status as the city's youngest billionaire, where the air finally seemed to soften. He was standing before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, the city lights bleeding into the room like a bruise. His fingers fumbled with his silk tie, a rare moment of human frustration that made my heart ache with a sudden, desperate hope. I stepped into his space, my breath hitching as I reached up to fix the knot. For a second, the world stopped. As my fingers brushed his collar, Rion froze. His gaze dropped from the mirror and locked onto mine, and for one heartbeat, the ice melted. I saw him, the real him, looking at me with a raw, flicking warmth that made my knees weak. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, his forehead almost touching mine, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the familiar warmth of his skin. I thought he was going to say it. I thought he was going to tell me he missed us. Then, the night shattered. His phone buzzed against the marble vanity, a sharp, intrusive vibration that felt like a physical blow. The warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the mechanical glint of a man who belonged to his company, not his wife. He didn't even look back. He just stepped out of my reach, answering the call mid-stride as he walked toward the door, leaving me standing there with my hands still raised in the empty air. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a smile at my own reflection, whispering to the silence that it was just the stress of the deal. I told myself that once this merger was over, I'd get my husband back. I didn't realize that the man I was waiting for had already been traded for a seat at a table where I was no longer invited. The silk of my emerald dress felt like a second skin, a shimmering ghost of a memory from the night Rion told me it made him forget how to breathe. I had spent hours preparing, one tracing the lines of my reflection, and wondering if tonight would be the night the silence between us finally shattered. I sat in the corner booth of the restaurant we had once only dreamed of entering, the candlelight flickering against the silver, counting every agonizing tick of the clock. My heart hammered a rhythmic, desperate tempo against my ribs as the minutes bled into an hour. When he finally arrived, the air didn't crackle with the electricity of our youth. It stayed heavy and stale. He slid into the seat opposite me, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his phone, his apologies sounding practiced and hollow. He was there, but the man who used to look at me like I was his only compass was gone. I tried to reach for him through the small talk, but the distance felt like a physical chasm. Then, the world tilted. A notification chimed on my phone, a mindless social media tag from a gossip page. My breath hitched as I scrolled, the image searing into my retinas. There he was, the same suit, the same restaurant, but the timestamp was 2 hours earlier. He wasn't alone. He was leaning in close to a younger colleague, his face lit with a genuine, effortless smile I hadn't seen in years. My stomach curdled as I watched him lift a fork, playfully feeding her a piece of the very anniversary cake I had painstakingly pre-ordered. The sound of the bustling restaurant faded into a high-pitched ring. I looked across the table at the man who was currently checking his watch, realized that he had already celebrated our 15 years. He just hadn't done it with me. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream. I just sat there, the expensive champagne tasting like ash in my mouth, watching the man I had built a life for treat our history like a chore he had to check off his list after the real fun was over. The realization didn't just break my heart, it cauterized it. Inside the most romantic room in the city, I had never felt more invisible. The office had become our only sanctuary, the only place where the ghost of our intimacy still flickered under the sterile hum of the overhead lights. We were hunched over the mahogany desk, our shoulders brushing as we dissected the market projections for the merger that would define his legacy. For a few fleeting hours, the silence between us wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. When his hand lingered near mine on the blueprints, or when he turned to me with that familiar, hungry intensity to ask my opinion, I felt a treacherous surge of hope. I poured every ounce of my intellect into that strategy, weaving a brilliant, aggressive plan that only someone who knew his mind as well as I did could create. In those quiet moments, as we breathed the same recycled air, I let myself believe we were partners again. The boardroom was a cathedral of glass and ego, filled with the city's most powerful players. I sat in the back, my heart swelling with a quiet, private pride as Rian stood at the head of the table. This was our moment. This was the empire he'd promised me. But as he began to speak, the air in the room turned to ice. He didn't look at me. Instead, he gestured toward the young woman from the restaurant, the one who had been feeding him cake while I sat alone. With a polished, effortless smile, he credited the entire strategy to her, calling her the brilliant architect of our future. The room erupted in applause, a deafening roar that felt like a physical assault. I watched her blush and accept the accolades, her eyes meeting Rian's with a triumphant shared secret, while I became a ghost in a room I had built. The drive home was a blur of neon lights and a ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop. Once we were inside the cold marble foyer, the silence finally broke. I didn't raise my voice. I couldn't. I just looked at him, my soul bared and bleeding. "You didn't think I deserved credit, Rian? That was my work. Those were my nights." He didn't even stop to look at me as he unbuttoned his blazer, his movements brisk and dismissive. He let out a long, weary sigh, the kind of sound you make when dealing with a bothersome child. "Don't be dramatic, Julie. It's about optics. She needs the win for her career." He paused, finally meeting my eyes with a gaze that was utterly hollow. "Besides, you're not part of the company. You're just my wife." The word "just" hit me with the force of a high-speed collision. It wasn't just a slight. It was an erasure. 15 years of being his strategist, his anchor, and his silent partner were reduced to a domestic title that he clearly no longer valued. Something inside me didn't just break. It shattered into a million jagged pieces, and for the first time, I didn't try to pick them up. I realized then that I wasn't his partner. I was his shadow, and he was finally ready to turn off the lights. The air in Sarah's living room smelled of expensive jasmine tea, and the sudden metallic tang of a secret being bled out. I stood by the window, my fingers curling into the velvet drapes until my knuckles turned white, staring at the blurred reflection of my best friend on the glass. The evidence was laid out on the marble coffee table, a series of digital timestamps, hotel receipts, and photos that I had stumbled upon in the shared cloud drive Rian forgot I still accessed. It wasn't just a fling. It was a parallel life. A life he had been living while I was busy folding his shirts and ghostwriting his legacy. I turned to Sarah, expecting shock, expecting the fierce, protective rage she'd always shown me. But her eyes weren't wide with surprise. They were heavy with a pity that made my skin crawl. She didn't reach for the photos. She didn't even gasp. She just sat there, nursing her cup, the steam rising between us like a shroud. The silence stretched, vibrating with a truth that was uglier than the affair itself. How long, Sarah? My voice didn't sound like mine. It was a jagged, hollow rasp, the sound of a woman who had finally reached the edge of her own endurance. She wouldn't look at me. Her voice was a low, shamed murmur that cut deeper than Rion's indifference. 6 months, Julie. Maybe more. The room tilted. 6 months of brunches, 6 months of late-night phone calls where I cried on her shoulder about his distance, and she had known. She had watched me drown in my own loyalty while she held the life jacket behind her back. You knew, I whispered, the betrayal tasting like copper in my mouth. You knew he was with her, and you let me believe I was the one failing? You let me think I just wasn't enough? Sarah finally looked up, and the look in her eyes was the final blow. It wasn't malice, it was an assumption of my weakness. I didn't tell you because I thought you'd stay anyway. I thought, what's the point in breaking your heart when you've already decided to endure anything for him? I didn't think you had it in you to walk away, Julie. A laugh tore out of my throat, a sharp, hysterical sound that echoed off the high ceilings. It was a bitter, ugly noise that signaled the death of the woman they all thought they knew. Even my closest confidant had written the ending to my story before I could. They had all mistaken my devotion for a lack of options. They had watched me burn for 15 years and assumed I liked the heat. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just invisible to my husband. I was a caricature to the world. The loyal wife who would swallow any insult as long as she could keep the name. As I walked out the door, leaving the tea to grow cold and the friendship to rot, I felt the last tether to my old life snap. They all thought I was trapped by my love. They never realized that the only thing holding the cage shut was me. The night air was a cold blade against my skin as I stood frozen outside the library door. The muffled laughter of the man I loved and the family I had served bleeding through the wood. The prestige of the penthouse felt like a tomb. She's useful, Mother. Rion's voice rang out, stripped of the warmth he reserved for the cameras. She's the anchor that kept the ship steady while I conquered the ocean. She isn't going anywhere. She doesn't know how to exist without me. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked, not to the bedroom we shared, but to the garage. By the time the car door slammed shut, the dam didn't just leak, it burst. The quiet, graceful Julie they all took for granted died in that front seat. I didn't cry quietly. I wailed, a primal, jagged sound that tore from the deepest part of my lungs, mourning 15 years of stolen ambitions and hollow promises. Every sacrifice, every overlooked betrayal, and every night I spent building his throne came screaming to the surface. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, the salt from my tears stinging the cracks in my spirit. I loved you, I whispered into the dark, my voice trembling with the ghost of a devotion that no longer had a home. I really, truly loved you. The weight of the diamond on my left hand suddenly felt like a shackle. My fingers were slick with tears as I gripped the band. I pulled. It didn't put up a fight. As the ring slid over my knuckle, the heavy silence of the car felt like freedom. I stared at the pale circle of skin where the gold had rested for a decade, realizing that the anchor hadn't just been pulled up, it was gone. And without it, Rion's world was about to drift into the abyss. The transition wasn't a roar. It was a ghost-quiet departure that left the penthouse feeling like an abandoned museum. I didn't pack the designer bags he'd bought to match his corporate image or the jewelry that felt like gilded handcuffs. I took only the woman I had been before I met him, the one who still knew how to breathe without permission. I left the wedding ring on the cold marble of the vanity, a small, circular tombstone for 15 years of devotion. I didn't leave a note. There was no need to explain a silence he had spent a decade cultivating. For the first 48 hours, Rian didn't even notice the oxygen had left the room. I could almost hear his arrogance echoing through the hallways, that smug certainty that I was merely sulking in a hotel, waiting for an apology he never intended to give. He assumed I'd crawl back when the credit cards were flagged, or when the loneliness grew too sharp. He thought my loyalty was a permanent fixture, like the foundation of his skyscraper, invisible, essential, and utterly immovable. But then, the unraveling began. It started with the small things, the missing files I used to organize, the forgotten anniversaries of his biggest clients, the subtle social graces I had provided that kept his shark-like edges from repelling his board of directors. Without my steady hand on the rudder, his perfectly calibrated life began to list. The silence of the house, once a luxury, now became a deafening accusation. He started finding traces of me in the most agonizing places. A dried flower from our first real date tucked into an old book, the scent of my perfume lingering on a silk scarf I'd forgotten in the foyer. I know the exact moment the regret finally punctured his ego. It would have been late, the city lights mocking him through the floor-to-ceiling glass. He would have reached for his phone to share a victory or a frustration, only to realize the only person who truly understood the cost of his ambition was no longer there to listen. He started remembering, not the useful wife, but the girl. He remembered the way I used to look at him in that cramped studio apartment, my eyes shining with a belief so pure it made him feel like a god. He remembered the warmth of my hand in his when he had nothing, and the way I had looked at him on our wedding day, as if he were the beginning and the end of the world. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just lost a partner or a strategist. He had systematically dismantled the only heart that had ever loved him for his soul instead of his balance sheet. He had spent years building an empire, only to realize he'd burned down the only home he ever had to keep the fires of his ambition burning. For the first time in his life, the billionaire was bankrupt. He finally understood my worth, but he was learning it from the echo of an empty house. And by then, the woman who would have died for him was already learning how to live for herself. The air in the grand auditorium was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hushed, electric murmur of the world's elite. Rian sat in the front row, his suit impeccable, but his eyes were shadowed by a restlessness that hadn't left him since the night he found an empty vanity and a cold ring. He was here to see the industry's new mystery titan, the visionary who had quietly dismantled his market share over the last 6 months with a brilliance that felt hauntingly familiar. The lights dimmed to a dramatic velvet blue. The moderator's voice boomed, introducing a leader who had redefined resilience. When the silhouette stepped out from the wings, the breath left Rian's lungs as if he'd been struck. It was Julie. She didn't look like the woman who had sat crying in a dark car. She wore confidence like a custom-tailored armor, her stride graceful and commanding as she approached the lectern. The spotlights caught the sharp, intelligent glint in her eyes. The same fire he had spent 15 years trying to dim so his own light could burn brighter. When she began to speak, her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a symphony of precision and power. She commanded the room with an effortless authority that made the billionaires in the audience lean forward, captivated by a mind they had all overlooked. Rian's heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He watched her navigate the complex strategies he'd once claimed as his own, realizing with a sickening jolt that she hadn't just helped him, she had carried him. Every lucky break he'd ever had was standing on that stage, finally claiming her own name. She looked directly at him, her gaze passing over him with a calm, devastating indifference. There was no lingering pain, no flicker of longing, just the absolute clarity of a woman who had outgrown her cage. The applause that followed her closing statement was a roar that seemed to tear the room apart. Rian stayed frozen in his seat, the weight of the truth finally crushing him. He had spent a decade calling her weak, calling her useful, calling her a ladder. But as she stood there, bathed in the adulation of his peers, the final revelation shattered his ego into dust. Julie was never the weak one. Her endurance wasn't a lack of strength. It was a surplus of heart. She had been a lioness playing the role of a lamb just to keep him warm. And the most painful part of the realization was the silence of his own soul. He hadn't lost a wife. He had discarded the only person capable of building an empire from nothing. She was finally standing where she belonged, and for the first time in 15 years, she was standing there without him. The gala floor was a sea of shifting shadows and clinking crystal, but my focus was a singular burning point in the room. I could feel Rian's gaze before I saw him, a heavy, familiar weight that once made me feel chosen, but now only felt like an anchor I had cut loose. As I stepped away from the podium, a young venture capitalist, a man whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by the genuine warmth in his eyes, stepped into my path. He leaned in, his laughter low and appreciative as he spoke to me, his hand hovering near my arm in a gesture of pure, unadulterated respect. From the corner of my eye, I saw Rian flinch. The muscles in his jaw tightened, that old, possessive alpha instinct flaring up like a dying ember. For a second, I saw the urge to intervene flash across his face, the need to reclaim what he still thought was his property. But then, he stopped. The realization hit him visibly, sagging his shoulders. He no longer had the right to guard a door he had personally kicked open. He waited until I was alone near the balcony, the city wind whipping my hair across my face. "Julie," he breathed, his voice stripped of its corporate steel, sounding small against the vastness of the night. I didn't know. I didn't see you." He took a step closer, his hands reaching out before dropping to his sides in a gesture of absolute defeat. "I'm sorry. For everything. Please, tell me it's not too late to fix this." I looked at him, and for the first time in 15 years, my heart didn't stutter. I didn't feel the need to fix his tie or soften his blow. I just felt light. I looked at the man who had been my entire horizon and realized he was just a man. "I spent 15 years building a life around you, Rian." I let the words hang in the air, a soft, final truth that required no anger. "Now, I'm building one around myself." I didn't wait for his rebuttal. I didn't stay to watch the regret finish breaking him. I simply turned and walked toward the elevator, the click of my heels a steady, rhythmic pulse of a woman who was finally, beautifully, free. Sometimes love doesn't end because you stop loving someone. It ends because you finally remember to love yourself.